Welcome back to another edition of the West of the Rest podcast, joined by my co host, Mr. Brandon Huffman, newly tanned, I might add. Brandon Huffman, the national recruiting editor at 24/7 Sports. I am recruiting analyst Blair Angulo, and we are back from the islands, the, as you like to say, Huff, the birthplace of this podcast. And I know we're going to get into the Polynesian Bowl. We're going to get into some recruiting updates. Also, going to dive in a little bit into what's been happening out west in recent weeks with the January contact period being open. Also, look ahead at some potential big Junior Day events for various programs across the region. Those usually set the table for what is going to be a really busy official visit season, as well as commitments in the spring and summer. But before we get there, Huff, I mean, we're about 220 something days until the return of college football. How are we feeling?
Gosh, it's crazy that the season felt like it took forever. And maybe it's because there's such a long gap between when the conference championship games were played and when the national championship game was played. But now we're so far out. Like, I got new couches delivered today, and it's like I have nothing to sit and watch in the couch for the next few weeks. I guess, yeah, we have 3 total football games left. This, as my wife told me, this season, not this calendar year, with the AFC and NFC championship game in the Super Bowl. But the weekends are going to be empty. There's nothing to look forward to from a college football standpoint because really the offseason's boring, right? Anymore. There's nothing that goes on. Oh, wait, no, that's the craziest thing is people don't understand. Football season is the chill part of the job. It's the other 8 months that make this job so entertaining. And the portal closes, the dead period ends, the season ends, but you got recruiting, you got junior days, you got all kinds of camps, activities coming on. No rest for the weary here.
Recruiting, in a way, takes a front seat now into the calendar. We've got Junior Day visits coming up. We've got unofficial visits. People and kind of the people that are handling some of the recruitments are going to start scheduling official visits. Commitments are just a few months away from really kind of taking center stage in the recruiting calendar. I think what's interesting, though, is to see a program like Indiana win the national championship. And the first thing that came to mind to me was, okay, Indiana is now going to be able to recruit in a different stratosphere, Huff, right? Like they are going to be able to go after the 4 stars and 5 stars. And even though they say they don't have any, they are going to be able to now. I think they have the cachet. They've built up enough on that resume. Curt Cignetti is a hot name. I think players realize that you go there to win and to get developed. But I'm worried and I'm questioning whether or not they should. Like, should they steer away from the DNA that got them there? Should they now dip their hand into the cookie jar that has extra calories in it? Or should they continue to build with the identity that got them there? Should they continue to pursue the 3 stars like Nick Saban said he did? And it was only recruiting guys based on their film and not by their stars. I mean, what should they do?
It's fascinating because we sat in Hawaii last week and we talked to Landon Williams-Callis, who has over 60 offers. And he said, is there any offer you don't have? It's like, I want one from Indiana. Jalen Brewster, who's committed to Texas Tech, he's the number 1 defensive lineman in the 2027 class. He said that, he's 100% solid at Texas Tech, but Indiana is where he's originally from, and he's interested in.
They're too good, though. Those players are too good. They're 4 stars, maybe 5 stars. They're too good to go to Indiana.
And, here's what I want. I wonder if Curt Cignetti strays away from what got him there, does he able to build that culture to where he wants it? Or does he need to kind of have the ragtag renegades, the guys that are portal guys to have his culture? But what's going to be fascinating is you're going to now see, first of all, there's a couple things that play. Curt Cignetti just ruined college football in this way. He didn't ruin college football. What he did is every coach that used to use, I need the 4 to 5 year to clean the underbelly to build my program, there's no more excuses. He took the losingest program in college football to a national championship game in 2 years. Okay, so now nobody's going to get patience. He's one of one. He's a unicorn. We're never going to see another thing like that. But now every program that hires a new coach has to feel that there's hope. you also can show that, hey, while we talked about the last few years, the national champions being heavily built around high school recruiting with a couple of portal guys here and there, Ohio State being pretty core centric of their high school recruits, but thrown in a Will Howard and a Quinshaw Junkins, a Caleb Downs the year before. Michigan was pretty heavily recruited from that team. Washington, they played in the championship game, was Michael Penix, but mostly homegrown guys, Georgia as well. Now you're going to see schools say, hey, maybe I need to go to the portal route. But it's also, he took 30, 40 guys that weren't highly thought of even out of the portal and turned them into an elite team. So, does he stray from that? I would imagine that now that he knows he's going to be there for the long haul, now that he knows that Indiana is going to be around for the long haul, high school recruiting is going to be that much easier. But does he think, hey, if I want to win national championships, maybe I need to have a veteran roster, and I can't wait for my guys to sit around and develop, or those guys don't want to sit around and develop? This is going to be the most fascinating case study moving forward, because is he one of one? Is he unique? Is he going to have the only one that's going to be able to do that approach and make it work? Or are other schools going to mimic it? Or are they going to stick with the previous non-outlier programs? That's why that win was so the season has been so fascinating, because I really wonder what Indiana does and how they move from here. And if other schools try to mimic that or think that it's a one-off.
I was at Curt Cignetti's debut at the Rose Bowl to kick off the 2024 season, where they just ragdolled that UCLA team, which was the first game for Deshaun Foster as well. And everyone's like, oh man, like this is going to be rough for Deshaun Foster. Like this team is getting pushed around. This isn't going to be a good team. And, it turned out maybe it wasn't such a bad performance, when you had a Carson Schlesinger and, some of the other guys that ended up getting drafted, and they were in a way a bit competitive there, but it was just an indication of things to come. I do think it's going to be interesting to see how they attack recruiting, especially on the West Coast now, because they do have a reach, and they do have in a way kind of that visibility on the West Coast, since this is Big Ten country now, Huff, as you know, Southern California, the Pacific Northwest, we are living in Big Ten country. The other thing, I thought it was fascinating here to hear Nick Saban in the pregame talk about how he didn't chase stars, but I distinctly remember him dancing with grandmas at five-star celebrations, on the eve of National Signing Day. So, I don't know. It was very interesting, kind of revisionist history in a way.
100%.
Even said Josh Jacobs was a 0-star, right? When he was clearly like a top 5 all-purpose back in his class, a 4-star prospect, and in a way, it's like, come on, like what are we doing? Like, you already are Nick Saban. There's no need to say, oh, look at me, look what I did. And it's like, no, like, just give Curt Cignetti his flowers for what he's doing, and don't say that you did it the same way, because you didn't. It's just just look at the recruiting rankings.
Exactly. And, for all the years of the accusations of the Bama bump, he never had 0 stars ranked in his classes. Yeah, he may have had a couple of 3 stars here and there, but, Nick Saban benefited from those rankings. It made Alabama look good, and it helped get other really good players to go there. So, it is revisionist history, but at the same time, he is the best coach that college football has ever had. And his former receivers coach and recruiting coordinator, despite being in his mid-60s, maybe he's the next great coach, because what he did was incredible. It's funny, but this whole offseason, when you look at the 2 teams Indiana lost to last year, it was Ohio State and Notre Dame, the 2 teams that played for national title. And people, hot takes exposed, or freezing cold takes was on fire last night with all the hot takes in the offseason about Indiana. Showed last year that they were a fraud. They wouldn't be able to do it. They were not going to be able to be the team that they are. And they sure showed that they were able to do that. And again, you look that they've already been able to go back into the portal to get Josh Hoover out of TCU. Fernando Mendoza off to the NFL. His brother Alberto went into the portal. So they got Josh Hoover coming in. Can they keep this success going? Did Curtis Rourke walk so Fernando Mendoza can run? But I am fascinated. In fact, bringing it closer to the West Coast, Jake Hildebrand, who's the number 1 player in Arizona in the 2027 class, he announced his top 10 on New Year's Day. And for the first time ever in a football one that I can remember, Indiana was in the top 10 for a top 247 player out West. That's the kind of impression. So we talked about that on this show for years, that You see the bump in your recruiting the year after a good season. Now, I think people thought maybe Indiana was a little bit of a, again, was 2024 a fluke? Was it going to be the exception to the rule? Was it going to be the rule? And now I think in 2025 season, winning the championship in January 26th, they show that they are not a fluke, that it is not the exception to the rule, that this is how we need to expect Indiana to be kind of maybe what Clemson was in the latter part of the 20 teens. And that is going to help their recruiting immensely. And I think it's going to be very fascinating. Remember too, Blair, that NIL at Indiana, as insignificant as Chris Signetti has tried to make it sound, when you got a guy like Mark Cuban publicly saying, he wants to support the team, now the NIL is going to be there. So it's going to make Indiana that much more attractive to recruits.
I think we also have to give Miami its flowers. And I don't know, we can say Miami is back, right? I think that's been a theme, just like Texas was back a couple years ago when they made their run, just like Michigan was back when they went on and won their national championship. I think Miami, when they are good, and we've said this about a number of programs with that blue blood tag, when Miami's good, like college football is fun. I mean, just how cool was it to see, some of the alums there on the sideline? Kind of gives you a flashback of what college football used to be. And, we love nostalgia, right? That's such a big thing. And, now we're waiting on like Nebraska to be back, right? Now we're waiting on USC to be back, just to kind of bring it full circle and give us, in a way, that holistic look at college football. Huff, let's get into some of the Polynesian Bowl takeaways. I mentioned the tan that you are now sporting. It's going to get a lot darker soon, right? Because of I love the comment there by Is It True Fam? Yeah. Make high school recruiting great again, and I think it's getting there. I think it's getting there. You know what's going to be really interesting? I think it's going to turn into a lot of drama, as we've seen. There's going to be a lot of drama there near the finish line now, which is what recruiting used to be. Now, everything is in a way wrapped up by June, heading into July. Everyone wants to focus on their season. Everyone wants to focus on fall camp. But as we saw this past cycle with the contract negotiations and the leverage and fighting for this or that, or figuring out that another school's making a charge, or not turning in a letter of intent until everything's, in a way kind of lined up the way you want it to in some of those rev share contracts. I don't even think do we even want to call it NIL anymore? I'm just going to steer away from NIL because it's not name, image, and likeness by any means.
Not at all.
I do think that when money is going to be exchanged the way it's being exchanged, it's just going to create and ramp up the drama. And in a way, high school recruiting is going to be back.
Mm-hmm. And I think he had a follow-up question. Is high school recruiting developing and retaining players dying? High school recruiting is not dying. I need people to stop saying that high school recruiting is being killed by the portal. What it is that it's recalibrating. Those high school football players are still going to college, guys. Those players that are coming out of the portal still played high school football. They just recruited at a lower level. So instead of a school bringing in 25 guys and maybe taking a 24th and 25th guy to develop, they're going and bringing in 15 guys out of high school. And then they're going and taking a kid that was developed at another school. So it's almost like the FCS and the G5 schools in a lot of ways have been turned into what JUCO football was, where you go there for 2 years, get film, bet on yourself. But players are still going to college. There's still schools that are adding football. Yes, there have been colleges that have dropped football, but those high school football players are still having a college to go to. It just may not be at the level they thought they were. See, when we say high school recruiting, people are only thinking FBS recruiting. FCS schools are signing better classes than they ever have. Okay, D2 schools are signing better players than they ever had. It's not uncommon for us to see guys sign with Big Sky schools that had Power 4 offers early on. All right, it's not uncommon for us to see D2 guys sign that had FCS and G5 offers early on, even Power 4 offers early on. What it's doing is it's recalibrating where you may be signing, but high school recruiting hasn't died. It's the level of which players are getting recruited. Because Blair, last I checked, we saw a bunch of schools on the road last week, the day after the portal closed, the day before the portal closed, Thursday. High school coaches were hosting showcases in January, things that we usually saw reserved in May. They were hosting early morning showcases in January to show off their 27s and their 28s. And so it's different. Now, what I would say is senior year recruiting may be dying. You're not going to get, I was talking to a guy recently who We were talking about Devin Tompkins, who played at USC, who went into the portal. Devin Tompkins did not have an offer going into his senior year because he didn't play football until his senior year. He plays his senior season, which happened to be the fall of 2021. All right. If he had been a senior 1 year before, he would have never been able to go play college football because the high school season got wiped out in 2020. But he bets on himself, has the basketball background, ends up going to USC. All right. Guys like that, you're not going to see very many senior evals. You're not going to see a guy like Jackson Dart use his senior season to explode. Maybe you will. Maybe I guess we saw it a little bit with, oh, goodness. What's our Traden Bessinger, where he blew up as a senior and really had all the Power 4 offers, but those are going to be few and far between. But high school recruiting, they're still having to provide the players to some level of football. It just might be a little bit lower of a level than maybe originally before.
I think developing is dying. Among those three,
no question.
Among those three, I mean, just look at it, and I don't want to single out Oregon, but I'm going to single out Oregon and look at some of the freshmen that just left the program. Cooper Perry, who at the time in his high school recruitment was choosing Oregon over the likes of Washington and Notre Dame and Texas and USC. I mean, he's going to go to Cal, right? Roger Saleapanga, the tight end from a couple of years ago, also choosing between some of those big name blue blood Big Ten SEC schools. He's going to go play at BYU. Vander Pluge, I think, announced earlier today that he's going to NC State when out of high school it was Oregon and Washington and some of these Utah, some of these schools that I think carry a little bit more name recognition out west. So I think development is dying in on both fronts, right? I think college coaches don't really have the time or the energy anymore to invest in a player. They want the immediate impact guy that's going to go in there and see the field and give you meaningful snaps and a contribution, especially with the type of money that's being doled out in rev share deals. You need the returns. And then I think the players are also, they don't have the patience for it anymore because they see that, hey, if I don't see the field, if I don't go out there and make plays, if I don't continue to elevate my own game, I'm going to get lost in the shuffle. And maybe when I go into the portal, it's going to be too late to have that name recognition, right? To have, some of the draw or some of the appeal that I did out of high school. So I think development now happens at a tier below. And that's why we're seeing so much roster turnover. Retaining players, I think that's a year-long situation, right? You're having those conversations in the summer, you're having conversations during the season. You're trying to make sure that you invest in the right types of guys that will be back, and you try to tell some of these players, hey, you're going to be a part of our plans moving forward. Don't think about going into the portal. So I do think that development among those three things that he brought up are the ones that are affected. David Woods, our friend from the Podcast of Champions, unless there's another David Woods out there.
There is only one David Woods.
He says Pluge, not Plug. Wow, game changer for me. Yeah, it's Vander Pluge. Anything to add there?
I'm going to make a hard left back on something because I got to stay on task. If there is being development being done, it is a lot of times at the FCS level. And I think one of the best testaments to that was Montana State. They just won the national championship. And imagine being a Montana State fan. Imagine being an Illinois State fan. All right. You're watching your team playing for a national championship 2 Monday nights ago. And all you see on Twitter is not, oh my gosh, these players are electric. It's like, oh, this guy needs to go in the portal because this guy's going to make a ton of money at this school. And Montana State ended up retaining just about every one of their significant players, whether it was Taco Dowler, whether it was Adam Jones, Illinois State as well, the kid from Arizona that went off. He decided to stay. That's a culture when you're convincing guys to stay there and turn down the money. So there is still developing going on. It's just not at the highest of levels. But again, how long does that go on? You look at a guy like Brent Vegan, and I use him as an example because 2 years in a row now, he's been a finalist for a job in the new Pac-12. Last year was at Washington State. This year was at Oregon State. And he stayed at Montana State to win a national championship. Now he did it. Now they're, a chance to win it next year. But you're looking at the development he does. Are you going to see more schools start going after FCS coaches and bringing them in where they are developing? Or is that only going to work at the FCS level where you can develop them? And, in the case of the Dowlers and Adam Jones, those guys are from Montana. But I think that there still is developing going on. We're just not necessarily seeing it at the biggest of levels. And I think part of that too is the coaching carousel has been so crazy in the last couple of years. When, if you look at the Big Ten, you take out, a guy like Kirk Ferentz, obviously Ryan Day's been there since the late 20 teens. There's been a lot of coaching turnover in the Big Ten. There's been a lot of coaching turnover in the Big 12. There, with the exception of Kirby Smart, there's been a lot of coaching turnover in the SEC. So now, you don't even give your coaches 5 years to develop. I think back to, 2021. Nick Rolovich gets fired in the middle of the season for not getting the COVID vaccine. Jimmy Lake gets fired in the middle of the season for really losing at home to Montana. We could say it was because he pushed Ruparake Fuabai. Let's be honest. It was because they were crappy that year and he lost to Montana at home. Both those guys didn't make it to year 2. This year, we see Deshaun Foster get fired in the middle of year 2. Trent Bray get fired in the middle of year 2. Both are alums of those schools who took over kind of awkward situations. But the patience from athletic directors, from fans, from boosters is now that you don't even let your coach have time to develop anymore. You better win pronto or we're going to go backfill that position immediately. So we are in this age of football where I don't even think you can expect development to be done at the Power 4 level because the expectations are so high.
Okay, before we get into our Polynesian Bowl takeaways, just want to remind our listeners that we're proud to partner with the Avery Huffman DIPG Foundation. We're working to end the deadliest childhood brain cancer. Find out how you can help at averystrongdipg.org. Huff, this is a judgment-free zone, right? Can I take a sip of my my matcha cold brew here?
Hey, I'm gonna drink a drink of my Body Armor Zero Sugar.
I kind of had to jump on the matcha train. I'm sorry. It's
all right. No judgment.
It's good. It's good. Packs enough caffeine for the day. Polynesia Bowl takeaways. Let's start with some recruiting updates, Huff. You just wrote about top 24/7 running back Noah Roberts from Chandler, Arizona, goes to Basha High School, has kind of a working top 10, top 12. He's narrowed down his list. He wants to continue to narrow down his list. Who are the schools that you're watching with the talented ball carrier?
So right now he's got a visit to Oregon coming up this weekend. He's going to USC the weekend after. He's going to do a midweek visit to hometown Arizona State, and then Texas and Michigan are the other two that are really lined up for a visit in spring. Texas wanted him down in Austin this last weekend. That became difficult because he was in Hawaii on Friday night playing in the Polynesian Bowl. But I think what you're going to see is the top 10, he wanted to get it narrowed down to a top 5. Ohio State is also in there somewhat as well. He took a visit there during the season, but it seems like it's those 2 new Big Ten schools in Oregon and USC with, Michigan, who is already in the Big Ten. Texas has been a longtime factor. And then hometown Arizona State, they're punching. They're still trying. But I think his top 10 is really a top 5, maybe a top 6 if you count Ohio State. And I still think that Oregon is in a good spot for him.
Okay. So, that would be pretty significant because they just played a true freshman at running back. And we just talked about, right, the need to get some production from some of these young guys, especially if they're going to go to that level initially. That's an appealing destination for a player like Noah Roberts, who I think feels like he has the ability, right, to go in there, contribute, get snaps, get yardage, score touchdowns, all that good stuff. I think that's part of the process. And that's part of what some of these players have to figure out is like, do I go to the school that has the bigger logo on the polo, or do I go to another route where I might be the guy early on? And then if anything happens, I can always level up, right? I could always transfer to a different situation. I think that's where recruiting has changed in a way.
And I think that, we're at this stage now where, I must have been Faison Brandon, who, was going into his junior year, number 1 quarterback in the country, number 1 player in the country. And he had schools pressuring like, hey, can you make a decision here? Because we need to get moving on our quarterback. And so that timeline has been sped up so much that, a lot of times you get guys that, I'm not saying this at all about Noah Roberts. I'm not saying this about anybody really, but a lot of times guys make a hasty decision because they're being pressed to make a decision at the school that they want, but then schools want to have their classes lined up in June. They want to be able to go into July with their classes sewn up. And so I think in a lot of ways, for a guy like Noah Roberts as an elite back and at a position that doesn't have a lot of great depth and great talent, he becomes that much more desired by those schools. As a result of him being one of the best. He's the best running back out west in the 2027 class. But you're seeing schools that are saying, hey, can we get a decision even earlier than June? Rather than, hey, let's get it in June. We'd love to have a decision made before we get into the spring.
Yeah, another player that is planning to get out to both Oregon and USC in the coming weeks is Eric McFarland, the elite wide receiver from IMG Academy, originally from Las Vegas. So I think we can still claim him, Huff. He's still a west of the rester.
Both the MVPs we can claim from the Poly Bowl.
Yep. So George Toia won the defensive MVP 2027 defensive lineman who is now playing his college or his high school ball in the state of Texas, originally from Fontana, out in the Inland Empire. So Eric McFarland, I think it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up at USC. Now, he's got a ton of schools after his signature, right? It's the Georgias, it's the Ohio States, it's the Texas and the Texas A&Ms, and some of those big name schools that are going to be competitive from an NIL or rev share situational. But I think USC appeals to him in a lot of different ways. Not only is it closer to Vegas, where he's originally from, but I think what he saw from Makai Lemon in that offense and being kind of a key target and a player that they go to in big time situations, he pinpointed that as a big reason why he thinks he could be a really good fit for a Lincoln Riley offense playing for the Trojans. It's a school that's been recruiting him really hard. He mentioned the dynamic ability of not only the slot receivers, but the way they're able to move guys around and shift formations and make sure that he's going to be able to get the ball in his hands. I think that's really attractive to him. So I would keep an eye on USC. Now it's going to be an uphill battle. Like I mentioned, there's a number of other big name prominent programs in the mix there, but I did get the sense that USC will have a shot, and it's significant because they are not going to sign a big class off in 2027. They are probably aiming for the 15 to 17 range in terms of high schoolers. They just brought in 35 at the high school level in the 2026 class. 2027 is going to be a lot different. So what does that do for the numbers, and what does that do about the selection process for them to identify and make sure they're locking in on the elite guys that they handpick? And I think Eric McFarland fits that, especially because he brings a different skill set than what they signed in 2026 at the receiver position, right? Caden Dixon-Wyatt. You got a Mark Bowman who's going to play a bit of a hybrid tight end receiver spot. Luke Weaver from Notre Dame High School in Sherman Oaks. You bring in a Trent Mosley who, maybe is not as quick or as shifty as an Eric McFarland, but does a lot of the Makai Lemon stuff as well in the 26 class. And Tron Baker, that's the other pass catcher that they brought in, and he's a different body type as well. So when you're thinking about complementing what you already have in the room, McFarland does a lot of the stuff that former USC receiver Zachariah Branch kind of brought to the table. So that's one school I think to monitor with I think who he's what, the number 5 rated receiver now in the 2027 class after reclassifying from 2028.
Yeah, and I think that because he was the number 1 receiver, top 10 player in the 2028 class, and I think Malachi Tony has now showed that you don't need to lose your luster if you reclassify. If you're good, you're good. And it's just good to see that USC is finally going to get a big play receiver there, because they haven't had any of those for like the last 30 years. Boobie Feaster coming in, had a good week in Polynesian Bowl. And that comes on the heels of Tanook Hines having a great Alamo Bowl with Makai Lemon and Jacoby Lane not playing. So, if USC can get Boobie Feaster, Trent Mosley, Luke Weaver, and then you follow it up with a guy like an Aaron McFarland, a dynamic just guy in space. I mean, that just shows you again that USC's receiver development, Dennis Simmons, Chad Savage, both doing such a good job with the inside and the outside. That's something that if you're USC, you got to be very excited about.
Let's talk a little Sione Cajo, 4-star quarterback. We mentioned him a bit on the show last week when we were doing that live from the one and only Kona Brewing on the east side of the island. And, we mentioned then that he was probably our most consistent quarterback, or maybe our favorite quarterback that we had seen all week at the Polynesian Bowl. I think he's taking leaps and bounds in his own development and progression. And he gave us some pretty significant recruiting news saying that, hey, like he wants to come off the board sooner rather than later. And there are some schools that are jostling there at the top.
Yeah. Washington, Oregon, Cal, and Stanford, and then Duke was kind of the random one in there making a push. But Oregon had long been the leader, and then Washington kind of emerged in the early part of summer and has kind of maintained that. I keep a little bit of an eye on Cal only because he's got an extensive relationship with new head coach Tosh Lupoi, who was actually the one who offered him at Oregon, even though Will Stein recruited him. But Tosh also recruited his older brother Ale to Alabama after he was headed to Washington. So there's a lot of familiarity with that program and with that staff. But I think that Washington right now sits in a very good position to keep him home. And I would anticipate that decision is going to come sooner rather than later for Sione Kaho.
If the Huskies do get that one over the line, how big would that be for their quarterback room? What's the outlook with Washington?
Well, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Now that there's no portal window in the spring, it looks like Dash Beerley and Keenan McMillan are going to be staying. You've already got Damon Williams for at least another year, and that was a whole other story in itself. And, it makes you wonder, is Damon Williams going to be there in 2026? Or I'm sorry, 2027. He's going to be a true junior. Reality is there's not a huge market for undersized quarterbacks in the NFL to go early. So he may be better off staying for that second year. So does that impact what Dash Beerley and Keenan McMillan do following the 2026 season? They did sign Jared Zammit this year out of New Jersey to come in as part of the 2026 class, but then Sione Kaho comes in 2027. Maybe sits in a really good position there where maybe Beerley McMillan feel like, hey, we've now wasted 2 years sitting behind Damon Williams, and there might be a third that we have to wait. And if Damon Williams plays in the 2027 season for the Huskies, Kaho's a true freshman, Zammit's a redshirt freshman, true sophomore. They potentially could battle for the job in the 2028 season. So it definitely will put the pressure on Beerley and McMillan to make a decision one way or the other.
Another underclassman that we wanted to spotlight, 2027 offensive lineman Ian Alosio from Timpview High School down in Provo, Utah. He was also at the Polynesia Bowl, one of the select group of 27 stuff that I thought was impressive in one-on-ones and kind of that physical setting where you're battling against guys that are older than you. He's not the biggest offensive lineman, but I think he's well built in not only body composition, but I think when you look at his length and his physical upside, I think is pretty good. He's been playing offensive tackle at the high school level. He's going to move inside at the next level, and he's got a lot of athleticism. He can pull. He can even snap the ball if you need him to in a pinch. Well-rounded, versatile offensive lineman that is very technique sound, has a lot of the fundamentals that you look for in a young lineman, and like I said, the physical upside, because you could put on easily another 40 pounds on him without losing some of the flexibility. Now, he did tell us right now it's looking like a BYU Utah battle. Don't sleep on Michigan, obviously, with the new staff there in Ann Arbor. That's, I'm sure, going to make him a priority. I think this one is maybe kind of staying in the Beehive State if we had to call it now.
It's fascinating too how with the hiring of Kyle Whittingham at Michigan, how on today's Tuesday, we keep looking up and down our timeline, and you're seeing Michigan dropping in on a lot of kids in the state of Utah right now, and there's a familiarity there. So while for a lot of these guys it look like BYU and Utah, there is something powerful at that block M. When those coaches come in, and Jim Harding has, we saw Spencer Fano this last weekend out there at the Polynesian Bowl. He was the Polynesian College Player of the Year. See what Jim Harding was able to do with potentially not just an Outland Trophy winner going in the first round, but a second off the tackle going in the first round with Caleb Lomu. That's going to help Michigan with those recruits from the western part of the country. So, while it was a BYU-Utah battle last week, like you said, with Michigan now having 5-6 coaches that came from Utah and BYU, and that presence in that state, that could be attractive to those guys. So I think if Michigan, Jim Harding, especially with offensive linemen, wants some of these guys in Utah, it's going to make it really difficult for the new Utah offensive line coach, Jordan Gross, who's coming in with a elite tackle of his own, and Kelvin Obot, who he coached in high school, and then TJ Woods, who was in Hawaii at the end of last week doing some in-home visits himself. It's going to make for some interesting battles there.
I think what's really intriguing to me when I look at maybe what Michigan's going to be able to do, and I just saw they offered Diesel Dart, the two-way standout from Corner Canyon, the brother of Jackson Dart. They've been offering Peyton Higginson and a number of other players there in the Beehive
Sam
State. Sam Nagata, the son of Oregon legend, NFL icon Haloti Ngata. I think the brand pull and the appeal of playing on a stage like Michigan over a place like Utah and BYU, and that's not a slight to them at all, because we obviously ring and talk and kind of sing their praises all the time about how cool it is, right? Rice-Eccles Stadium or Lavelle Edwards Stadium, or just the way that fan base and both of those schools gravitate towards football. Michigan's an entirely different animal, and I think even the coaches will admit that are now there. They probably look around the big house, or they look around the facility, or they look around campus, and I think they know that it's a different thing, and it's gonna, I think, translate over to recruiting. Now, they were able to land a number of players in the portal. Smith Snowden, one of the best nickels in the country the last couple of years, going there to play for the Wolverines. John Henry Daly, the dynamic pass rusher, is also transferring there. They were able to land Celesi Moa, something that we hinted at in last week's episode. He announced his commitment live on NFL Network during the Polynesian Bowl. They have another visitor on campus right now, and by all indications, I'm checking my phone, it sounds like the Michigan Wolverines are doing incredible work there with Ernest Nunley, the 3-star defensive back from Western High School. So they're going to, I think, sink their claws into a lot of the prospects out west, and I think it's a smart move in year one, right? You go to what you know, and you go with the places that you have a lot of success in, and that's another thing. I think we're going to start to see that with Penn State as well. Those are two schools that we're going to continue to talk about.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating too, is that, again, we've talked about on this show that the ever presence of some of those SEC schools recruiting the West Coast kind of was what we created the West of the Rest for, and now you've got Michigan with a lot of strong West Coast ties, with Penn State with a lot of strong West Coast ties. Obviously, Ohio State's starting quarterback is a Southern California kid. They had a number of kids that were part of their national championship team that were from the West Coast. So it's interesting that you're seeing more and more schools, but Penn State is a school that is going to take advantage of the Big Ten, having a presence on the West Coast and having a coach with Matt Campbell, who his most prized pupil was from Arizona. All right, you've got a Kaika Malloy there, Danton Lynn, two coaches. Danton Lynn's from the Northeast, was a Penn State alum, but he spent time at SC and UCLA. Kaika Malloy is a West Coast. We saw a number of offers go out from Penn State on Monday in the state of Washington. I anticipate they're going to hit Hawaii heavy, with the Kaika being from the state of Hawaii. With Michigan, obviously Lewis Powell is from the Bay Area. They recruit Hawaii. So it's just going to add more and more schools that those West Coast schools are going to have to fight out.
Let's look ahead a little bit, Huff, now, and change gears to some Junior Day events that are coming up here, not only this weekend, but at the end of the month. Oregon, USC, UCLA, some of the notable ones that I think we're beginning to hear about more and more. Oregon, obviously, it speaks for itself a little bit because they've been so caught up in the college football playoff, just, obviously, and having to kind of do the whole retention thing with Dante Moore and then landing Dylan Raiola out of the portal and, making sure that their roster looks the way they want it to look heading into spring. This Junior Day event is going to be massive for them. 2 new coordinators, right? New offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator. Dan Lanning, I think, has to, in a way, continue to sell his program as like the trajectory arrow continues to point up, even though we don't know what those two sides of the ball are going to look like, right? Like, you go from a Tosh Lupoy to a first-time defensive coordinator. You go from a Will Stein right after you had gone from a Kenny Dillingham now to also, I think, to a first-time play caller in Drew Merringer. So there's a lot of questions that I think recruits will have about the Ducks heading into Junior Day, and that's why this event is an important one for them.
The other thing that's going to be, very fascinating with Oregon is, the questions about why did everybody leave? Why did all the young talent leave in this offseason? And obviously, in the case of Kingston Lopa, he leaves to go back to Cal, follows Tosh Laffoy. Jericho Johnson was in his second year. He leaves to go follow Tosh to Cal. But it was, guys like Roger Saleaponga that left. Why were some of these young guys, Roger Saleaponga, I think he scored the touchdown at the end of the Peach Bowl for Oregon. So does that cause concern, or does that help you with this 2027 class? Like, hey, there's not going to be as much young depth on that team. There might be some portal guys that are a little bit older, but does that help? But yeah, I think the big questions for him is going to be, Chris Hampton, Andrew Merringer moving into those coordinator positions where you've had the stability of Will Stein for the past 3 seasons, where you had Tosh as your DC for the 4 seasons. One thing, if you're, with Drew Merringer, I know he had a rough go of it as the offensive coordinator at Rutgers. I think lasted a year, maybe 2 as the play caller there. But one thing that Dan Lanning did show is when he lost Kenny Dillingham after year 1 for the head coaching job at Arizona State, he replaced him with the Will Stein. Now he promotes from within. He's a defensive-minded head coach. Does he give Merringer more opportunity and carte blanche to call it, or does he get more involved there? What does that do? But it sure helps when you have an experienced quarterback coming back and Dante Moore. But again, it's going to be a big weekend for Oregon with those guests coming from the Northwest. I know Jacoby Doyle, a top 5 player from the state of Washington, is heading down. Avery Michael, who is out of Turlock, one of the top linemen in Northern California, expected to be there. As you mentioned, Noah Roberts, Josiah Molden, who's the number 1 player in the state of Oregon. He's expected to be down there. So, Oregon is not going to skip a beat when it comes to recruiting. It's going to be a much different looking cast of coaches that'll be doing the recruiting.
Yeah, Georgia commit Dante Wright is another one that they're working on to get back up to Eugene as they continue to push for that flip. So Oregon, always a big Junior Day event for players, not only in the region, but I think nationally, to get up there and to start figuring out how high they are on Oregon's board, obviously heading into the spring and the summer before the official visits kick off. USC, UCLA also going to be maybe doing a dual Junior Day. I'm guessing, Huff, that there will be prospects that drop into one campus and then make the 13-mile drive over to the other campus and kind of make a day of it and then start to compare both of those schools. Now, for USC in particular, it's very important because, like I said, they are going to sign a smaller class in this group. And remember, Junior Day was such a big component and a foundational block of what they did last year on their way to signing the best class in the country. They, I think, identified a lot of top targets at that event. I think it's going to be the same this time around, where they are going to single out some guys, go into individual meetings, make sure that they know where they stand with certain prospects, and then attack from there and know who to target, who to put at the top of the board, who to maybe push for early commitments. Those are all, I think, key components of what the general manager, Chad Bowden, and his whole entire staff are going to be able to do. That's why it's important for USC. And then on the flip side, UCLA, the first big recruiting event for Bob Chesney and a revamped recruiting staff. I don't know if we've seen a recruiting staff like that at UCLA ever. And, with the number of offers that they've put out in recent weeks, with the visits that they've done on campuses during the contact period, with the amount of players that they brought into the program via the portal, I think, what's that going to look like? This is their first shot at it. And so what are the Bruins going to do from a logistics standpoint to make this Junior Day feel like a Junior Day, which hasn't really existed for UCLA in this modern recruiting era?
One thing that I will never understand, and I will say that to Deshaun Foster's credit, for as many warts as he had as a head coach, they were smart enough to do an elite night in the middle of January, the last week in January. Then they did a Junior Day the weekend before, a little bit bigger, whereas Chip Kelly was alerted to. You also remember when Deshaun Foster, heading into his first season as the head coach, they hosted a July event back when the dead period was open for that 1 week. USC, UCLA, Washington, Oregon all hosted an event. Oregon hosted Saturday Night Live. Washington hosted a barbecue at the lake, and USC hosted an event. UCLA hosted a pool party. But I'll never understand. Yes, I remember talking to an old UCLA assistant coach during the Jim Moore era. He said, you can't do a junior day in Southern California. You have to do a smaller meet and greet, because otherwise you invite 100, you get 400 kids that all brought their friends. And those are the 300 kids that you're spending your time wasted because you can't even get to talk to the kids you wanted. But it's such a good marketing tool to show these coaches, especially with the new staff. This is what we're doing. This is what we want to do. And if we're inviting you, you're on our radar. But if we are recruiting you, you're going to know well before that junior day where you stand with us. So, welcome to the 21st century at UCLA.
I think I wrote about it earlier this week, Huff. They offered Sosine Schuster, who is a freshman. And for the longest time, like, UCLA was not offering players until the first day of their junior year, right? When contact is allowed or permissible. And in a way, they were self-imposing a restriction on themselves by not offering younger players, and were instantly in catch-up mode. So, already they're changing in a way their approach, their DNA, kind of how they want to blueprint this out. And I think that's what I'm curious to hear from some of the recruits later this month, January 31st. I've been told that they're going to, in a way, kind of shape it around the basketball game. I think they host Indiana that day inside Pauley Pavilion, and I think that's when Bob Chesney will be formally introduced to like a big crowd. And so, that it sounds like it's going to be a day and an event for them. So I'm really curious to see how that looks and how that shakes out. Huff, anything else before we go? I saw you actually broke some UCLA news just a couple minutes ago.
Broke some UCLA news a couple minutes ago. Zahir Young, the offensive lineman from Diablo Valley College up in the East Bay, announced his commitment to UCLA. An interesting story there. He played at Sacred Heart Cathedral, was on their state championship team in 2022, played with Jerry Mixon, who just announced he was returning for his senior year at Oregon, as well as R.L. Miller, who went to Fresno State. And he was a year behind them, but I was talking to him, and he was a defensive lineman. He had an offer from Morehead State out of high school and went to Nevada to walk on. Ultimately, it didn't work out. Went home, back to the Bay. Went to Diablo Valley College, where Jimmy Collins, Marcus Blackshear had been the head coach and the offensive coordinator of City College of San Francisco, not far from Sacred Heart Cathedral, and convinced him to make the move to the offensive line, and saw his recruitment take off with Boise State offering, Cal offering, Colorado offering, and UCLA, and ultimately picked UCLA. So he'll enroll this offseason. That's now 3 JUCO. I mean, times are changing. UCLA is actually out recruiting high school players, and they've got 3 JUCOs coming in. I mean, Indiana's winning the national championship. UCLA is actually trying to recruit. What in the heck of 1976 basketball is this?
Yeah, I'm over here drinking matcha cold brews. I mean, what?
Yeah.
The 2026 is different, Huff.
Left is right, and right is left.
Yeah, anything else before we sign off and bid adieu to our viewers and our listeners?
Guys, don't act like jackasses at 7-on-7 tournaments so they don't get shut down in the middle of them for people acting like dipshits. That's all I got. My PSA.
All right. So for Brandon Huffman, I am Blair Angulo. Thank you so much for tuning into this edition of the West of the Rest podcast. We'll catch you again next week.